the story of the 20th century seems to me a story of rivers of blood flowing. The Maos, the Stalins, the Pol Pots, the Hitlers. And so here I am as a Jew rooting for your robust faith, and I've been an observer of evangelicals since starting out accidentally, I would say. Maybe it's providential. Every once in a while I even start thinking try not to. But my Christian friends say, oh, Mike, it's no accident. It was all providential. I got involved very, very deeply in the whole issue of Christian persecution. Never expected to. And so I've had this unique experience of dealing with the evangelical community. And I have found it frustrating. I found its leaders often lacking. But I've been very deeply moved by what I've seen and by most of all, the just root decency of people in pews around the country. There was a rabbi who once said to Jews, the Bible Belt is our safety belt. And he was right. Notwithstanding the caricatures that are made of your faith, which I am out there looking to shatter. And how then, in the face of this, how then the issue for me and the legacy I want to leave to my grandchildren is to help your faith remain robust. And for reasons both subtle and otherwise, I'm very deeply concerned by what I see. And I want to talk about that. Now, this is not the time, Marvin, as you pointed out, for me to say why, but I'm rooting for you guys, and I'm doing it for purely selfish reasons, because I have 6 of the neatest grandchildren that ever were. Trust me, they are really special, these 6. And I think a world in which you play a major role, an America that remains, as we still are relative to the rest of the world, a deeply faith-based world, as against what's happened to Europe, as against what's going on in the mainline Protestant churches, is an America that will be better by orders of magnitude than we would otherwise be. So how do we shatter caricatures about who you are? And how do you recognize the threats, short and long term, that I think are being confronted by evangelical leaders? That's an issue that, as Marvin has said, that I'm very deeply engaged in, and look forward to talking with you about.
Okay, so take that as preamble, and we're going to now go back a little bit and see how Michael got to this point. The point where, I'll tell you, Michael is legendary in Washington, both to friends and foes, and he has a lot of both. Michael is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. He has been in Washington for a long time, but started out, let's just start with college at CCNY, right here in the city. And Michael was mentioning upstairs, as several of us were having dinner with him, that he really learned the art of political infighting at CCNY in college.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I'm a product of New York City, and this when I was a young man, it was even more vibrant. It was not a kind of beggar city as it has become and has recovered from becoming, but it was just a wonderful, vibrant community. And CCNY was the only place I ever thought of going. We couldn't afford any other place, our family, but in any event, it was a place where students were still angry for an education, and it was just and I came there and I got involved in student politics. And there's a whole tradition there of where the communists used to fight the socialists and fighting the there weren't many conservatives out there at that time, particularly, because conservatives were those guys who favored segregation. Conservatives were, and we were patronizing and unfairly dismissive, I should also say in retrospect, of many conservatives, even of my time. But all those internal fights on the part of people who seem to agree on so many issues, you learned how, and this is a critical thing, there come to be crossroad points. And they're often very, very subtle. And when you get to those points, you're never quite sure whether you go to left or the right. But let me tell you, depending on which fork you take, you wind up as far away as you possibly could from the position you would take if you went the other way. And so there are just always these points which you've got to be sensitive to if you want to know, if you want to get to, if you have some strategic idea of where you want to go. And that's what I learned in student politics, that people who seem to agree had critical differences, that in taking you down, in helping to, in putting people down roads which seemed really swell places to go, if you weren't careful, you'd wake up one morning and scratch your head and say, how did I get on this bad side of the issue? We were talking at dinner tonight, and maybe we can elaborate on that a little bit more. One of the young women was talking about how she at Sojourner Truth, do you call them colleges here? House. Cared about the trafficking issue and was involved in the issue of trafficking of girls. The sexual trafficking issue is one of the issues that I've worked on, of children. And I could see how earnestly she cared about that. And without getting into the details now, I said, you know, if you go down that road, and it seems wonderful, here you are caring about trafficked children, you're being used by the people who are often, you can be used by people often, who want to legalize prostitution and just and make these monster pimps free from the law until somebody could prove, which it's often very, very difficult to do, through the testimony of their victims, that they have been brutal at beating up the girls that they control. Now, how does that happen? I'm just working for girls who are trafficked children, who are trafficked. I'm in the children's, helping children. What could be more Christian or decent than that? And yet, in this manipulative, subtle world where pointing you in the direction of protecting children rather than ending the enslavement of all women, whatever their age, which is what the real battle is, subtly pushes you down a road where, hey, okay, it's terrible to traffic children. What about adults? Well, it's terrible. Then it's not so bad, unless you could prove that this awful trafficker beat up the girls. So you have a regime now where if you can traffic, it's terrible to traffic children, and if it's an adult, it's terrible to beat her up. And if you do, throw the book at the poor guy. Except that now you're in a world where if you're trying to convict these monsters, first you have to prove that the monster knew that the girl was under 18 or under 16. These are girls who look like they're 40 by the time they're 17, 1 year into life. No jury will ever say, guy will say, I didn't know I thought she was 25. Harder to convict these guys. Harder to convict these pimps for beating up these girls. These girls are afraid to testify and often don't. On the other hand, if your issue is, this is slavery, it's so inherent that our objective, even though it's a little tougher for us, is to make it a crime to be a pimp. You then begin to tackle the issue. And what about the people who come in on our battles and say, hey, What about all of these labor exploitations of poor women? Shouldn't we get that involved in the mix? You've got to be sharp, and you've got to understand. It's a long-winded question, but I hope responsive, Marvin, to what you're saying. You've got to understand that it's tough to have a strategic objective. And I learned that at student politics at my college, because if the issue then becomes mushy, we're going to protect children or everybody from being exploited, you wind up with nothing. The bad guys own you. You're not targeted enough. You're not strategic enough. You're not tough enough. Because then you wind up in a world where being a pimp, and just to say the word doesn't convey the reality of the destructiveness, their destructiveness of the 50% of their girls attempt suicide, and of how, I said, Marvin, an ordinary pimp walking the streets with 3 women working for him makes something close to $700,000 a year, because he beats up the girl if she doesn't turn in a quota of $700 a night, $1,000 a night, 340 days a year. And it's all brutality, and it's all slavery. On the other hand, if you go down that road of, I want to protect people from abuse, and you're mushy in that way, the pimp is no different from the owner of a factory. The law leaves you alone until and unless your secretary comes and says, hey, he beat me up. Then the law prosecutes. Well, maybe secretaries do it in factories, but girls find it much harder to do. And then every case of prosecuting a pimp is a single case with 3 days worth of testimony instead of rolling up everybody, and the only evidence is, are you a pimp? Yes, I am. That's a crime. We convict you. How do you mobilize sentiment for that harder task is the question you learn if you get caught up, as I did, in the student politics. I used to be with communists, used to be on the student council, and they were always, well, let me add one other thing, Martin, then I really will quit, because I think there's another interesting insight. And it applies often to Christians, I see as well, who build enclaves around themselves. The communists that I would always be working with on some cause, they'd always be on my side, until we were about to win. And then they would up the ante to make sure we'd lose. I remember we had this issue of, can the head of the Daily Worker, the communist paper, speak on our campus? Oh, the bad guy said, nope, we won't let children hear him. We wanted to hear him and argue with him. We thought campuses were places where people should speak. And just as we were about to win the battle, it took us, months of just the most difficult battles with the Board of Trustees and the president of the college. Up steps one communist guy and says, it's all being caused by Cardinal Spellman in New York. Let's go picket his residence. And I would say with incredulity, well, how could you want to do that? We'll surely lose if we do that. That's what these guys wanted. Why did they want it? Because you find that in movements, another thing I learned at college, many people who seem to care about issues not only don't know how to win, they want to, let me go further, they need to lose. There's a psychological construct in them that says the whole world is corrupt and only I am pure and caring. And that way, the more you lose, the better you feel about yourself, because the rest of the world doesn't share these noble visions of yours. And every once in a while, as you get to a point where you're about to win, gee, you're not alone. You're not unique. You're not so wonderful. The rest of the world may not be so corrupt. You may have to look at yourself in the mirror for the first time and not tell yourself you're great because you care about some issue. So that was another thing. You have to be very, very careful about your allies. And sometimes, and I see that often, as I say, people who just don't want to confront the world, who don't want to deal with the world. I see that in Christian communities, are ready to condemn everybody else, because just if it's just us in the enclave, the rest of the world is terrible. We're the pure ones, and the way you prove your purity is constantly losing. I'm sorry for this long answer about it.
Well, it's
but I hope
interesting
this is
because
interesting.
we do have some elections here. Matt Fillingame over there is our student body president, but it doesn't quite sound as complex and Machiavellian is at CCNY, right? Wasn't that way? Anyway, okay, but it's interesting because.
But let me tell you, if everybody around here is naive and open to sort of, oh, you know, let's hold hands and do good, and that's your expression of Christian witness, there are a lot of people more manipulative than your president who will use you to a fare thee well. You got to be very tough-minded about your goals, and it's not for sissies to get in this business of making policy. If it was easy, I'm glad it isn't. I'm a conservative. I think change should be difficult. I think we should have to meet high burdens. So in order to have change and reform, it's not rhetoric. It involves subtly judging people. It involves picking targets. It involves defining strategies. These are very, very important things to do if you really want to make change.
So there's a verse about being as wise as serpents and as gentle as doves.
Something like that.
Something like that. So, okay, you go from CCNY to, well, Yale Law School, and then when you finish Yale, however, you do not go into corporate law or one of the
I
other
did
practices.
for a year.
You did for a
I
year.
went in for
1
a year, but when I was in Yale Law School, the University of Mississippi Law School, and then that was the center, the epicenter of the battle against segregation. The good old boys in Mississippi kicked out the old dean because he wouldn't applaud while they were trying to keep James Meredith out of the university and trying to maintain segregation. And so they thought they'd pull a fast one, and they got this guy who was just a lawyer from Pearl River County, said, why don't you be the dean? They thought they had a safe guy, but they didn't know this guy. And he was shrewd and gentle truly in that way, and he was a true reformer, and he spent a year at Yale Law School in my senior year. And then he went back and he said, hey, Mike, why don't you come and teach at the Yale Law at the University of Mississippi Law School? So I came and I taught in this, and that too was as an extraordinary exposure for me with a Christian community. I thought I was house Jew for every Baptist retreat in northern Mississippi for at least a couple of years, and it was an extraordinary experience for me to be there. As I say, we had the first integrated classes at the Ole Miss Law School, and that law school was, at the time, the most powerful institution of higher education in America relative to its community, because in Mississippi, everybody who counted was a lawyer, and there was only one law school in the state. And you actually were automatically admitted to the bar of Mississippi just from graduating from the Ole Miss Law School, and anybody else had to take a bar exam. And I need not tell you, it was the toughest bar exam in the world. Nobody passed that one. So here I was, right in the sanctum sanctorum, right in the middle of the University of Mississippi Law School, as people were struggling with the race issue. And I again discovered what I deeply believe, and what my immigrant grandfather taught me just about every day. He said, Michael, this is a blessed land. Never forget it. And it is. And I saw more openness and more decency and more possibility of change on race issues in this caricatured Christian Mississippi than I knew would ever be possible in the New York City that I grew up in. And there's a wonderful story of Mississippi that would be great, and I'm reminded of it just being in a classroom. It was sort of like this. I taught this contracts class in Mississippi, which was, kind of the central class for law school. And because I knew that there would be an imposed segregation, what I did was assign seats to everybody in the class by alphabetical order. And one day, unbeknownst to me, the dean, wanting to prove the change that was taking place, had invited Ebony magazine, the Black Community magazine, to take photographs of the new Mississippi Law School. And while I'm teaching, a photographer comes in, starts snapping pictures. And it was like a mafia bust. All these kids, ducking under the table, putting books in front of their faces as they were snapping photos in the first row. that at the end of the class, I called in those white students who were dodging and bucking and weaving. And I said, listen, I apologize to you. I wish you didn't feel the way you did. Obviously, there was one of the students, had his name begin with A, and this was right in the front row. I wish you didn't feel the way you did. But I apologize to you. The classroom is a private place, and if you get in trouble back home, you just call, have them call me, and I'll tell them I made you sit where you were sitting. You didn't do it on your own. And then I said, but let me make a suggestion. I suggest that each one of you buys a whole bunch of copies of Ebony magazine and put it away in the bottom of your sock drawer. Because 15 years later, from now, you're going to want to say that you were Reuben Anderson's friend. I tell you, I kid you not, 15 years later, darn near to the day, Reuben was sworn in as the first black justice of the Mississippi Supreme Court. Now that was for me, that was the Mississippi that I saw, and I saw the possibilities there. And it was an extraordinary experience for me to witness this community so very different in one sense from mine. But of course my community too was an Orthodox Jewish community, and so I had my own experiences with the rigidities of Orthodoxy and yet with its warmth and with its substance, and I have struggled with it. And let me also, before the next question, again, filibuster by one other point, which is having dealt with Christians, as indeed I have, on these issues, the trafficking issue, having put together coalitions which have very much involved evangelical and Christian communities. I'm so deeply grateful because exposure to Christians like Marvin, like Susan, have brought me much more in touch with my own faith. I'm much more rootedly a Jew. I go to synagogue now because of my exposure to Christians like Susan. And as Susan knows, she and I shared something, the Southern Baptist Magazine some years ago, because of my work on Christian persecution, named me and Susan and Billy Graham and Mother Teresa and 6 others the top 10 Christians in the world. The editor of the magazine was so embarrassed, and I told him how deeply flattered I was. But there I am. I was at one time one of the top Christians in the world.
This is Susan Olasky back there, along with Michael Horowitz. So, okay, now, I first met you in, I think, 1982 when you were in the Reagan administration. What happened between Mississippi and the Reagan administration to get you there?
It was interesting living in New York City. When I came from Yale Law School and I was practicing law as I said, what happened was I went, practiced law, came to Mississippi for 2 years, then went back to New York and was practicing law.
Corporate law?
Corporate law, making money, big firm. Well, no, actually, when I came back from Mississippi, rather than going to a corporate firm, when I finished, it was #1 Wall Street, a big law firm, and I liked the idea of a sole practitioner, which I'd seen in Mississippi, and so I found some crusty lawyer in New York City, and I practiced law with him. But there I was, practicing law in New York City, and saw this great city that I loved, that I had grown up in, that was so yeasty and vibrant, and it offered ladders for people like me to go to places like CCNY and get an education, descend into meanness and poverty as politicians, in the name of compassion, were bankrupting the city. But it was worse than that, because one of my clients was the unions for fire officers and interns and residents in the city hospitals. And there these politicians were giving away money they didn't have for political reasons and bankrupting the city. And the city went bankrupt. And it was a great moment for me because increasingly, as I grew up, one identified caring with being liberal in politics. And there I was thinking, I don't believe this stuff anymore. But as I thought it, what I more and more came to think was, there's something wrong with me. I'm just getting old and selfish. I don't care anymore. And then New York City went bankrupt. And that was a great breakthrough moment for me, because I realized that my reservations about all this so-called phony compassion that I saw cynically exercised in labor union bargainings and the dealings in New York City that I saw take place by the politicians, I knew that my reservations about all that 1970s political liberalism was not just practical. I always knew that, but it was deeply moral. There was nothing moral in a city which had produced opportunity for poor people suddenly becoming bankrupt. And so my own conservative coming out of the closet really came from being in New York City when the city went bankrupt and seeing that the rhetoric that often surrounded caring was, in some cases, a psychological need to fill the empty spaces that people felt inside themselves. In other cases was mindless, and in some cases really did involve a worship of secular gods, the notion that somehow if we redistribute income or if we pass enough laws, we can create the promised land. And that too was part of the ideology of New York City, and I saw it fail.
So you had already moved well away from Orthodox Judaism?
Never moved away from it, really. What I was a backsliding religious Orthodox Jew. I never confused Judaism with politics, okay, fortunately. And that was easy for me because I saw in my parents and grandparents a Judaism that was rooted not in politics but in synagogue, in Torah. And I could never move away from it. But I remember when I ate my first unkosher meal, I thought the heavens would open up and just just swallow me up. And I stopped going to synagogue. And so, yes, I thought of myself as a Jew, but the observance part seemed to me too problematic, often too suffocating, too this, too that. And so I was really pulled between different worlds is what I felt myself being. But in terms of any kind of observance, there was none at that point.
Yeah, but you didn't turn politics into a god.
I never did. I always, thanks to the exposure of my parents and grandparents and the world I lived, it was too suffocating for me. I wanted to get out of it in some way. But I also wasn't ever going to hold it in contempt. I never could do that, and I never have.
You know, to a lot of students, the Reagan administration is starting to seem almost like King Arthur's court or some mythical period, but you were actually in it right from the beginning.
It was.
And so tell us about what you were doing then.
Well, I came in with what every one of you who wants to shape the world need to come in with. What is it? Henry Kissinger wrote this, his memoirs in typical Henry Kissinger, I am the smartest guy in the world style. He may be, by the way, but what he said was, I came into government and I had this job as National Security Advisor. At the time, it wasn't an important job. It was doing paperwork on security stuff in the White House. And he said, I'm not using his exact words, but this is the takeaway. How did I turn the Secretary of State, who had been formerly the Attorney General, he'd been the President's own lawyer, he had headed one of the great law firms, how did I turn him into my personal gopher and assistant and marginalize him so that I made all the decisions and he had none? And he said, here's what I learned. Very simple lesson, he said. When you come into government, you learn decision-making. That is true. But you don't gain intellectual capital. You spend it. And Kissinger, would say, I would get memos from the bureaucracy telling me I have option A, B, and C. And I'd say, get out of here. I don't want options A, B, and C. I didn't come in here for that. Give me a memo with options X, Y, and Z. And they would throw up their hands and hearts and say, you can't do it. And I'd say, how come I can't do it? And they would say, and they'd often be right, Marvin, based on their institutional memory. They'd say, well, some guy tried it and he got his head blown up. And half the time they were right. But Kissinger had this intellectual capital. He could shape an agenda. He could think about where he really wanted to go. If he got a nasty blow from Congress or some newspaper headline, he knew where he wanted to end up. He wasn't just tactically managing from day to day. And whereas the other guy, he said, the guy who was Secretary of State, he would get the option memo A, B, and C, and every once in a while he'd say, I don't want any of them. And the next day, you'd need to be, a Jesuit or somebody with, you had to really have some guy who mastered in logic to distinguish the options of day one from the ones of day two. And he was owned and he made no change. Well, for me, having read, having thought, having written a little bit about these issues, it's like a kid in a candy store. There was a moving screen of issues, and any one of them I could pick. And then there was something else where I tried to make a contribution. 100 mainline ministers would come to town to witness for social justice, and everybody else was running for cover. And I would come in and say, I've got to speak to that group. Wow, this is great. And I'd come in, and they all hated the Reagan administration, and they thought we were evil, who really took pleasure in starving the poor. And I'd say, listen, I'm speaking to you, but only on one condition. You could see them smirking. My condition is this. I don't want you to judge the policies of the Reagan administration in terms of how comfortable they make the rich or well off they make the middle class. I insist, and if you don't accept it, I'm out of here. The only basis on which you can judge the policies of the Reagan administration is by how much hope and opportunity they offer the poor. Wow, that was pretty shocking. I mean, people thought. And once you could set the terms of debate that way, you could make the point, as I could and can 100 different ways if we had the time, that I was a conservative for the same reason I was out there fighting segregation in Mississippi. Because I thought, while conservative policies could be corrupted and had their problems, that the modern day state was the enemy of the poor. And when I would be in the Reagan administration and there would be these delegations of people marching with signs saying, how could you cut this program, it was all, and how could you, government is the tool of the rich and powerful. It was all I could do to restrain myself from going out there and leading the parade and telling them, you don't know the half of it. Because these protesters were often paid to come by trade associations who wanted bigger appropriations for some housing subsidy program which went to housing builders, didn't go to the poor. I saw that in program after program. I saw that the Great Society was a program that I thought shattered opportunity for the poor. And it was just, it was terribly important to fly that flag and think from that point of view. And it was terribly important to subvert, when I'd eat lunch at the White House mess every day, the people in the personnel office. I'd have read in some obscure journal, some Marvin Olasky, it wasn't Marvin, but somebody like Marvin would have written some brilliant piece on how we deal with tax policy or welfare policy. And I'd invite him to come to the White House. Sure, he'd come, take him to lunch, and I'd try and sneak him through the personnel system and get those moles who had intellectual capital into the Reagan administration. And there were a handful of us who did that, and we helped, I think, make it a more interesting place, and maybe contributed in some measure to the change that the Reagan administration was able to achieve.
Okay, then going into the 90s, the Clinton administration, and you begin becoming active on Southern Sudan.
Well, what happened was I paid my kids' orthodonture bills. I'll take it one step back. Reagan wanted to put me, and then Bush wanted to put me on the circuit, one of the circuit courts, the D.C. Circuit Court, the Federal Circuit Court. And the furor in the establishment and the American Bar Association was unbelievable. Somebody told me that when Reagan wanted to put me on the D.C. Circuit, there were 40, 50 people going through my life, ready to fight it. Because I was the ultimate apostate. I had been a civil rights law professor in Mississippi. I punched all the right tickets. It'd be pretty hard to mark me down as a racist. I cared as much. I was a knee-jerk, not knee-jerk, but I wore my heart on my sleeve. America was a place that was going to be judged by how much hope and opportunity it offered the poor. And God, they were afraid of me being on a major court. And they knew as well that I'd be on the short list for the Supreme Court, as indeed I'm pretty sure I would have been had I been on the circuit court. And so, the campaigns that were mounted were extraordinary, and they beat me. And then I went to practicing law. And gosh, it was dangerous for me to be by an open window. I just wanted to jump out as my partners were asking me how many billable hours I'd had. And I was thinking, God, I could be on the circuit court, maybe the Supreme Court. Why did my life go so badly? And, but I'd made enough money to pay my kids' orthodonture bills and went in the think tank business, where I was free to start thinking about public policy issues. And that was a great salvation. And now, I first began dealing with it on this tort stuff and economic issues that I care very much about. And then a man came into my life, interestingly, I accidentally, providentially, you judge. Whatever it is, I cannot tell you how grateful I am. Gitana Gitano was an Ethiopian Christian who was one of the leaders of the underground church in Ethiopia during the days of the communist regime and immediately after. For his punishment, when caught, he was hung upside down while they poured hot oil over his back and beat him with steel rods and did worse things to him. And he came to America. I had been with Mike McConnell, who actually, I say this, it's a joke, worked for me. Mike, some of you may know who Mike is. He's a judge on the 10th Circuit. Many people think the finest federal judge. And he, too, came to work for me when I was general counsel at OMB, and Mike came as a lawyer. He, too, what a lesson it was for me to learn about Christians and who they were during those years. And he had helped me, introduce me to this Ethiopian evangelical church, and I had become close to its leaders. And they were such awesome people whose faith was so inspirational to see, who were offered, the pastor of this church was offered millions by his uncle, who was a sheikh, to return to return to Islam. And he was starving, and he was trying to put together a church, and it didn't have any members. And his wife was working 12 hours a day, and I was with him when he got this offer, and he just laughed. The thought that he'd give up his faith, his association that he felt with Jesus on a regular basis for $1 million. It was a joke to Humphrey. And so I saw people like that. Oh, and I'll tell you one other story. The Reagan administration is a great one. I called in David Broder, who was the sort of dean of reporters, writes for the Washington Post, the big columnist for the Washington Post. And I said, David, there's an incredible story. You got to write about it. David, I have discovered in the Reagan administration something that our generation didn't believe. There are kids who are caring, intellectual, Rhodes Scholars, Supreme Court law clerks, and who are conservative. What? How could that be? I mean, anybody with a brain couldn't possibly be politically conservative. But David is a fair and an earnest reporter. And he was taking notes, and you could tell David was going to write a column about this new movement, thinking of Mike McConnell and his wife Mary. Mary was the first female Rhodes Scholar, and Mike was, when he was working for me, he was getting offers from Harvard Law School, Yale Law School, went to Chicago Law School. I mean, he was just so wonderful and brilliant and conservative. In my generation, in the days of apathy, to be a caring person, you had to be yelling and screaming and shouting and pushing. Well, in later generations, when they saw this yelling and screaming turn into mindless anarchy, the virtue was, there were quieter virtues of being thoughtful. Well, David didn't understand it, and our generation didn't, but there I was discovering people like Michael and Mary and others in the Reagan administration, and David was about to write the column. And then I pushed it one step too far, and I said, David, here's a really amazing thing. A lot of these kids are Christians. I could have said Martians. It would have had the same impact. I think I remember him literally dropping his pencil. That's probably he didn't. But he was just so stunned. What do you mean, Rhodes Scholars who are Christians? It just, you know the word oxymoron. This was the ultimate oxymoron, a Christian intellectual. And I lost David. He never wrote the column because, you know, I was obviously going way too far. Well, here I was meeting people like Hanfrey. In any event, Gaetani came to work. He had just come from Ethiopia as a housekeeper. And we offered jobs to people in the church. Deborah and I sponsored about 20 Ethiopians from that church to come to the United States. What a blessing it was. Maybe the greatest thing I've ever been able to, my greatest blessing as an American. Here were these people suffering in refugee camps, and all my wife and I had to do was sign our names to a paper that the pastor filled out, and these people came to America and had lives and opportunities. It was incredible. And of course, I knew what that meant for my grandparents who were immigrants to the United States. And even Humphrey Gaetani came to work for us, and he started describing the persecution he had encountered. And it was clear that if he was sent back to Ethiopia, he would be murdered by the radical Islamic groups that were there. So I went to an immigration lawyer and I said, okay, hey, let's get him a green card. And the lawyer said, well, what's the grounds for his asylum petition? Well, he's a Christian. She said, Christians? Aren't they the ones that do the persecuting? They're not the victims. We don't do Christians in this country. And here this man had just told me how he'd be murdered, as he surely would if he were sent back. How of the torture he sustained and the torture others were suffering in those countries. And here was America, this country that gave life and hope to my grandparents, that allowed them to immigrate, which is why I wasn't a lampshade or a bar of soap in some concentration camp. And here was this lawyer, very experienced lawyer, saying, hey, we don't do Christians in this country. I was stunned. And when I went into the think tank business, I never thought I'd be involved in the human rights stuff. And I started looking at it. And God, did I make an eerie discovery. It was that in so many ways, you guys had become the Jews of our time, the scapegoats of choice for the thug regimes around the world. They'd killed too many of my people to be useful for thugs in many dictatorships. You know, 100 years ago, if you wanted to know whether there was human rights in a country, you didn't need a fancy human rights survey. You'd go in the local synagogue. And if the Jews were persecuted, you knew that there was some dictatorship persecuting everyone else. Now, going into remnant communist countries or Muslim countries, you don't need a fancy survey. Go to an evangelical church, go to a house church, and if they're scared, and if they're getting persecuted and arrested, you know nobody else is free. And that's the role the Jews played. Canaries in the coal mine, scapegoats that the thugs beat up and told everybody, you're next. If you speak out, this is what I do to people who speak out. And when the rest of the world didn't speak out, they wound up the next set of targets. Well, that's what was going on with Christians. And I called Christians and I said, okay, I didn't know who the Christian leaders were, but there were a couple of activists who worked on those issues in Washington, and their whole job was quiet diplomacy. Let's write a letter because some Christian leader is in jail in Russia, jail here, and we get the president to write a letter and maybe we can spring that guy out of jail. And sometimes they did, at which point the dictatorships arrested 3 more Christian leaders. And I knew that didn't work. And I knew that silence wasn't a way of dealing with with dictatorships. And I knew that dictatorships were more weak and fragile than we supposed. We always think we're weak and divided, and dictatorships seem to speak with one voice, and they're strong. The truth is the opposite. I knew that. And so I began this issue of trying to energize the American Christian community to speak up for their own people. And I cared very deeply to do that, again as a Jew. Because in the 1930s, as Hitler was coming to power, President Roosevelt wanted to appoint a Jew to the Supreme Court of the United States. And a delegation of the leading American Jews went to Roosevelt and said, "Don't do it. You'll make Hitler really mad. You'll provoke more anti-Semitism in the country. Don't do it." And I saw the same kind of fear, unwillingness on the part of Christian leaders. Quiet diplomacy works. After all, if they're killing our people now, when we're quiet, when we blow the whistle and speak out, and we're just weak, they'll kill them even worse and more. And I said to them, listen, I agree. I'm willing to accept the fact that if I'm wrong, there's blood on my hands. But you've got to accept the possibility of blood on your hands because of the silence that you have, and you've got to speak out. And Christians were afraid of being caricatured. And there were a lot of Christians who did not understand the moral virtue of your faith, because the establishment had defined you in terms of the sins committed in your name. I remember meeting with one of the leading evangelicals, and I said, as we were getting involved in this thing, well, let me just say, what I did then was write finally a letter to 150 mission boards, just got their names, and said, if you don't speak out for your own people being persecuted, if you want to work on the issue, I'll work with you. But whatever I have to do, if I have to shame you, I will do so. You will not remain silent. You cannot remain silent. We can move this country to do it. And they would come to me, these leaders, and say, I care, but the people in the pews don't care. And I knew that was nonsense, that they were failed as leaders, that the people in the pew could care if they could craft the right kind of strategy that wouldn't involve just, that wouldn't lead to compassion fatigue and, people praying and then moving on. That we had to devise some kind of approach, and we worked at it, and we did it. But I remember one time with a very...
Tell us about the approach, particularly concerning Sudan.
I will get to Sudan and Christian persecution, all these other issues, but I will get to what happened. This one story is a very instructive one. It was a major figure in the American evangelical community, and I said to him rhetorically, why am I involved in these Christian persecution issues? And here I am, I'm a Jew. I'm the only non-Christian who won the Wilberforce Prize that Chuck Colson gives out. And I've been, and I used to get introduced, what is a Jew doing leading us on this issue? Well, 2,000 years ago, there was another Jew who did. I mean, it was just but I said to him, why am I so involved in this issue of Christian persecution? After all, I said, my grandfather told me stories of how on Easter Sunday, there were pogroms where all the Jews had to hide in the cellars. Oh, he said, oh, please forgive me. Oh, my God, that's so awful. Now, as it happened, these were Catholics, he was Protestant, it didn't matter. And he was right in not making, he was just guilty. And it was out of his own virtue. Oh, please forgive, oh, God. I said, okay, I accept your apologies. Now, can I ask you a question? Now I want to tell you something. If it wasn't for the rooted Christian decency of this country, I would be a lampshade or a bar of soap, and so would my people. It's whatever the sins, your virtues have been so extraordinary. I owe this in so significant way to the Christian roots of this country. And his response, can I say that? Am I allowed to say that? I said, you darn well better. again, as I said to you before, I was thinking for the sake of my children and grandchildren, you better have more confidence in your own virtue and your ability to say it. And you ought to be shrewder in shattering caricatures about you and not accept them for yourself. But that was the Christian community that I confronted. Now, how does one do it? As I say, there's a, I come from Washington. There's a, the biggest mistake people make in Washington, and they get it 180 degrees wrong, and I learned this in the civil rights movement. People think you need coalitions to pass laws, and that the coalitions are the means and the laws that get passed to the end. The truth is exactly the opposite. It's the effort to pass laws, not fake laws, but laws with teeth in them, and the means of making sure those laws get enforced that build coalitions. The end is a coalition of people who have a sense of confidence in their ability to change things, who have this sense of purposiveness and experience, and most of all, confidence in their ability to make history and make change. And so that was from day one, that was my goal. When we first started to pass the International Religious Freedom Act was the first thing, Marvin. And again, it was, a tough struggle. People were trying to say, here were these Christians trying to elevate religious freedom above all these other human rights, which was crazy because the members of Congress, like my congressman, the great Frank Wolf, who was probably the most decent guy that's ever been in politics, or surely the most decent guy I know in politics. He cared about all sorts of human rights. He was out there in Perm Camp 5 in Siberia, and was out there in Romania when the Iron Curtain fell, and holding starving Ethiopian babies in his arms when there were famines. And he cared about, he was the chief sponsor of the Religious Freedom Bill. The idea that he was establishing a hierarchy just to favor his own people was just crazy. In fact, I wanted the law only to be about Christian persecution. And the Christians said, no, we can't do that. It's not Christian. I said, you know what? All right, I'll give in to you, but I got to tell you, if we can stop those thugs from burning down churches, we'll develop cracks around their walls. And when the campaign for Soviet Jews began, nobody said, hey, what about the Christians they're persecuting? The Christian leaders understood that if you could stop this big, powerful Soviet Union from beating up Jews, there would be freedom for everybody else. It would be open. And that by fighting for your own people, you're fighting for everyone else. But I couldn't persuade them, and we had this religious freedom law. But we were attacked constantly. But we built coalitions. There were many people, there were Jewish leaders who said to me, look, I can't be against a law for religious persecution, dealing with it, but I'll give it, I'm in favor of it, but don't ask me for more. Another truth about politics. It doesn't matter. It's so unimportant whether somebody's on your side or not. Least important thing I know. What really counts is how high up on the priority list the issue is, how deeply they care about the issue. But then there were a handful, I'm proud to say, of Jewish leaders who said, look, I may disagree with those Christians on abortion, on whatever other issue, but I can't be silent. And they led their groups into arm-in-arm partnership, often for the first time. And they discovered that Christians, they used to say Jews had horns on them. That was the old thing. These secular guys and some of the discovered Christians didn't have horns on them. To their amazement, these were caring, wonderful, intelligent people. They discovered that through this sort of thing. So we built this coalition, and we got a reluctant administration to pass the law. I remember meeting Madeleine Albright once, and she found out who I was, and she wagged a finger within a quarter of an inch of my nose and told me that if that law passed, I'd not be able to conduct foreign policy. And I remember a New York Times columnist wrote, how dare these Christian right people fight on this religious persecution bill, and really all they care about is Christian victims of persecution. That's all I cared about, in a sense, because I knew that the ripple effects of caring and succeeding there would protect everybody else. When there is, said this New York Times columnist, the great Chinese dissident Wei Jingsheng, a great figure, who who spent 15 years in a Chinese jail after the Tiananmen Square demonstrations. And he really was the symbol of freedom for the world. And Wei gets out of jail while we are fighting to pass this bill. And who turns out to be the #1 advocate for a bill to protect religious freedom? Wei Jingsheng. He says, if you can stop the Chinese from persecuting house church pastors, there will be a hope for freedom for artists, for labor unions, for political dissidents, for everyone. This is so important, the religious persecution bill. And so, but we were dealing with the State Department that thought of Christians as, gee, those, and that was the other thing that got me going too, as I started to say, word for word, this notion of not getting involved in Christian persecution was the same as was said about my people as Hitler was coming to power. Hey, I'm against persecution, but these people are clannish. They're strange. I wouldn't want them as neighbors. That's what they were saying. Often Jews, often in the same dinner parties, in the same houses where others said it about their people 70 years ago, they were saying it about Christians. So it was an incredible battle. I got to meet Christians. I would get phone calls one day from Jews saying, why are you consorting with the enemy? Next day I'd get a phone call from somebody saying, Mike, we've just discovered you're not, this was the phrase they use, you're not yet a completed Jew. Why don't you come to church with me? And I would tell them what I've said here. I'm so grateful to you as Christians because you've rooted me more deeply in my own faith as a Jew. And thank you for calling. But these were generous calls of people who wanted to share the good life as they saw it with somebody they cared about. But in any event, that was the experience. And from that, when we finished that issue, I thought, we have organized a coalition of Christians to be effective. I mean, this was such an effective coalition. We had Bill Clinton saying, if you pass that law, I'll cause the State Department, I'll reach into the bowels of the State Department to fudge the reports, and they'll never report any religious persecution. Because if it does, it'll screw up our relations with other countries. And we won. And the New York Times never covered the story, except one story, a front page story saying the bill was dead. And 2 weeks later, the bill passed by unanimous consent, thanks to former Senator Bill Armstrong, who I got to join me, thanks to the great leadership of Chuck Colson, who's getting old, by the way, is the greatest blow to Christian leadership in this country. It's just nobody else is around who I'm on camera, so I won't say it quite as vividly as I might otherwise, but there's nobody who can approximate the leadership role he took in the Christian community.